I've given the permission for Dell, sir. Can you switch on his video?
Yes, yes. Sir, please you open your video. Jack, you are ready? Madam, JP, madam, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Admin.
Yes, Professor.
Yes, please, spotlight.
Yes, Professor. Jebra ma'am is muted. Can you remove the mute and you can start? Sir, Dell is given, co-host is given. Sir,
Okay.
on the video, sir.
Okay, he called me and he asked me to start the program.
No issue. We are ready. Jebra ma'am, we can start. We have 425 participants.
Yes, please. I'm going to start now. You please give me the spotlight so that I give you some. Give some hints.
Done, sir. Done.
Yes. Thank you so much.
So, Professor Ayers, are you starting?
Yes. Right now. Now I'll give you time.
Yeah. Sure.
Now, good morning to all the participants. I extend a warm welcome to all of you to the second day of 7-day international online workshop on teaching English language and literature, trends, issues, and challenges. On behalf of the organizing committee, I wish to tell you that we are extremely happy the positive responses that you have given to us. Amazing, the responses are amazing, and really we are excited, and we are so committed to give our best to satisfy you throughout all the sessions. And even now, I got a call from the technical team yesterday that even at 10 o'clock they are getting responses from the academicians to permit them to attend this workshop. And I had a discussion with the committee and particularly with the Dr. Professor Marx, and he said you permit them till 10 o'clock today. And we are accepting your request till 10 o'clock today. We accepted, and even I got a call at 10:30 from Hyderabad, and he requested me such a way to accept his request, and I sent him the link. Probably he would have joined here, or maybe he's joining us in a short period of time. And I'm extremely happy. We are humbled to express our gratitude to all the participants. And we are giving now, we are trying our best to give you the best sessions throughout the program. And when I was going through the feedback, and 85% of them have said that it's so excellent. And the rest of them said good. And such a positive feedback that we received that encouraged us to give you the best sessions. Now, one of the best sessions which you are going to witness now, and we have invited an eminent professor from Madras Christian College as a resource person for the formal session, and he is very much available to moderate the session. The committee has requested Dr. Teresa, madam, who is heading the Department of English at Mother Teresa University. He has also accepted the invitation, and it's a pleasure, it's an honor to invite my beloved sister, Professor Jaypriya, to moderate the session. Thank you. Over to Jaypriya, madam.
Thank you, Professor Ayers. Happy and healthy morning to one and all present here. I welcome you all to today's session on New Historicism, Theory and Praxis. So New Historicism is a literary theory based on the idea that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both the history of the author and the history of the critic. So, New Historicism acknowledges not only that a work of literature is influenced by its author and circumstances, but that the critic's response to that work is also influenced by its environment, beliefs, and prejudices. So, New Historicism acknowledges and embraces the idea that as time changes, so will our understanding of the great list too. So, to speak on New Historicism today, we have amidst us Professor Krishnamurthy Ganesh, a visiting faculty from University of Madras for today's session. And I take immense pride to welcome Professor K. Ganesh to this session. Dr. Krishnamurthy Ganesh joined the Department of English, Madras Christian College in June 1986 and continued to serve the department till he retired in May 2019. With a passion for literature, inculcated by his amazing teachers in Madras Christian College, he taught 3 generations of students. His doctoral research was on metadrama in both Oriental and Occidental traditions, and his research and teaching interests are theaters of the world, film studies, ecology literature and development, English studies in India and India studies, and Shakespeare in diverse contexts. He became the head of the Department of English in 2014 and had the proud privilege of serving the department in that capacity for 5 years. We are honored by your presence, sir. We welcome you on this day and kindly take over the sessions.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone there. Very happy to be a part of this 7-day webinar. At the outset, I would like to thank the faculty of Mannar Naicker College and all the supporting organizations. And my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Armstrong, my friend and present head of the Department of University of Madras, English University of Madras. I'm happy to see friends like Dr. Marx. I'm truly happy to be a part of this celebration of literature and theory at this particular point in time. I have chosen to talk on New Historicism, theory and praxis, and I also wish to thank Dr. Jayapriya Prasad ma'am for consenting to moderate my session. Now, as she rightly said, New Historicism is not a theory per se, as Stephen Greenblatt would not call it a theory. He considered it to be a practice. But I still use the word theory because we have been able to say, get what is called the idea of theory in the context of the PPT is not coming in. Just a minute, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Share screen. 2 minutes. Yeah. So.
Yes, sir. We could see the file, sir. Can you put that slideshow, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, 2 minutes, sir. Is it fine?
Fine. Super.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, as I told you earlier, let's say Stephen Greenblatt himself wishes to situate it as a practice. But I wish to talk about New Historicism as a theory because it has become an amazing reading strategy. And the first point that I would like to make with regard to this mode of reading, as I always say, it's a reading strategy, it's a mode of reading. So I would like to speak about the reason for existence of such a theory and the timeline. Now, the first point that we need to make is that New Historicism, as the name is given it, is a response to Old Historicism. Now, one needs to define what Old Historicism is. Old Historicism obviously regarded a literary text not as an outcome of the social and political forces that are behind literary production. It always saw literature as as an isolated exercise. Right? So, old historicism did not consider history to be the fountainhead of literature. It never saw literature as one of the significant products of the historical processes that create literature. Now, old historicism also believed in the efficacy of historians and history. In other words, old historians never believed or never thought about historians being subjective. Right? That the subjective element is totally absent in a historian and in the history making process, which we call historiography today. Which means, let's say, they granted enormous power to the historian to escape his or her own subjectivity. So old historicism, let's say, is rejected or obviously responded to, reacted against, primarily because of these two, important premises of new historicism. That literature is obviously the end product of socio-political cultural forces, both of the author and of the time. And number two, it obviously can never ever sanction what is called subjectivity. And what is even more interesting is Stephen Greenblatt very clearly says that even a new historian's approach to a text cannot escape subjectivity. That is, even a new historicist cannot escape his or her own subjectivity, thereby saying that you can't give it sanction, you can't give it complete authenticity, right? It doesn't come from, an oracle, like that. So that led to what is called the return to history. Now, we know that in the Romantic movement is called, return to nature. New historicism can be defined as return to history. Now, what do you mean by return to history? Very clearly, it means that we reject the notion that history is background and literature is foreground, that history and literature are involved in a very significant process of amalgamation. Literature is not history, but history is obviously showcased through literature, because we believe that history is not monolithic, history is not one, history is many. You have various texts, let's say you have various histories coming out of a monolithic historical account. Thereby we mean that history, return to history will mean that a work of art or a textual material that we come across embeds history. Every literary work embeds history, and our job is to look for that embedded history or histories while we interpret the text. So in that context, Stephen Greenblatt and others who started this particular movement, let's say the academia particularly, they experienced a sense of, let's say, an ethical failure in reading a text in a very isolated way. Right? They thought that it would be a kind of an immoral activity to read a literary text, without its background, without its other historical and political concerns. At the same time, they were interested in textual integrity, and what they did very interestingly, they appropriated the language of, deconstruction. And like Barbara Johnson says, that the purpose of deconstruction is to tease out from a text warring forces of signification. It's a beautiful expression that she uses. We'll go to a text by Derrida himself later. But she makes a very significant point that the reading, a new historical reading, will bring forth warring forces of signification. By warring forces, she obviously means contradictory text within the frame of one single text. And she calls it a teasing out. Warring forces of signification. That's why the language of deconstruction has become extremely important. And obviously, deconstructionists believe in plurality, right? They believe that every literary text is polyvalent, and it is that polyvalency that they wanted to explore and understand. Plurality of significance is what they constantly believed in. Now, where did it begin? It began in the University of California, Berkeley, and the founding member is, Stephen Greenblatt. right? Stephen Greenblatt is the person associated with this movement called New Historicism. Now, who are his influences? His influences were two. One is Michel Foucault, and he is called a crucial antecedent of the New Historical movement, who obviously was, say, very important in contributing, say, what is called the nexus between power and knowledge. Right? That power and knowledge, let's say, share a very meaningful or terrible, depending on the context, nexus. In other words, power is circulated through knowledge systems. Power is inherent in knowledge systems. In other words, you can almost say that history is what gives rise to discourse, and discourse impacts history. In other words, they believed in the reciprocal impact of history on, say, reciprocal history impact of history on discourse and discourse on history. So this power knowledge nexus, which Foucault talked about, obviously gave these people an inspiration to study the operation of power structures in every single literary text, which I will take up when I deal with the praxis part of this particular, say, discussion. And then Michael, say, Bakhtin is very important, let's say, with regard to the idea of carnivalesque, because carnivalesque leads to what is called a reversal of hierarchies, right? Hierarchies are questioned, and in a carnival, there is a constant attempt at de-hierarchizing, right, and de-canonizing things. And though that canonizing, decanonizing process, that de-hierarchizing process can happen only for a particular time frame, it still is considered to be a significant act of subversion, but allowed by the power structure. A king may play the role of a clown may play the role of a king, but these roles will be reversed when that time is out, the carnival time is out. So in that particular situation, we see that he obviously coined this particular term, carnivalesque, in Rabelais and his world, Bakhtin. So you have two major influences, Michel Foucault and Bakhtin, on New Historicism. And they created a very significant journal called Representations, which can be called the organ for New Historicist thought. It is there that they began their discussion, began their reading. And when you want a specific timeline, you can say that it peaked between the 1970s and 1990. Now, it doesn't mean that New Historicism or New Historical reading is out of fashion now. I'm not saying it is anachronistic, but it had its peak period between, say, 70s and 90s. And then what did they deal with? First, they responded to early modern, very interesting. The New Historicists called the Renaissance the early modern period. So you have a lot of studies on Elizabethan playwrights. And why did they take that? Let's say primarily because when you take a distant time line like the Elizabethan period, the 16th century, you can imagine, let's say, that you have a host of texts, not only from literature, but from different disciplines, that you almost have a huge corpus, a palimpsest, let's say, of multiple materials, that now you can look at it in a very different way. And more importantly, as I said earlier, you look for operations of power, right? You look for operations of power, right? You have Germaine Greer in her book on Shakespeare very clearly says that even Shakespeare wasn't free, meaning that he was given a clear brief as what to do. So they responded to early modern literature. They called it Renaissance. I mean, what is called Renaissance in, say, history books, they called it early modern literature. And then they responded to 18th century British Romanticism, right? They obviously commented on Byron and Keats and others. And they studied the Americanist studies from colonial through late colonial to the Republican period. Now we go to the quotation from Derrida. What do you do when you deconstruct a text? The first point that he makes is, let's say, certain things that you embed within a text is unperceived by the writer, right? You can be very unconsciously establishment prone, or you can even be unconsciously subversive, right? Normally we say subversion is more conscious, but it is quite likely that when you question something, you question the status quo. Let's say you are obviously indulging in a kind of a subversive reading of life through your work of art. So one important thing is you need to study or aim at a certain relationship between, say, what he commands, the writer commands, and what he does not command, using patterns of language. But what does deconstruction do? It's not a lecture on deconstruction. I'm taking a path which is relevant to our discussion. Deconstruction attempts to make the not seen accessible to sight. Right? The not seen accessible to sight. In other words, it is a mode of reading that gives visibility to texts that have not been seen in the two. That's why, let's say, every time you make a deconstructive reading, or every time you make a new historical reading, certain things that you had not seen previously comes to light. Now, this can happen even in traditional reading. As Keats beautifully said, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It never, ever passes into nothingness. Now, that's a traditional mode of reading where the work of art gives rise to multiple meanings, let's say multiple significant meanings. But here, we are talking about multiple socio-political, cultural meanings within a text, which is not expected to have them. Right? That is why we say not seen, accessible to sight. And then Ganesh makes a very important statement, right? It carries a plurality of significance, or saying many things which are fundamentally at variance. That's why I said contradiction is extremely important for us, right? Later on, I'll speak about Henry V. Henry V of Shakespeare is considered to be a play which is supposed to be hugely patriotic, right? Ralph Richardson, say an actor, said that Henry V can be called a national anthem in 5 acts. But today, when you make a new historical reading of Henry V, everything has changed. It's not a patriotic play in the sense that there are a lot of voices which question the establishment and question the king within that particular play, which I will take up later. But I'm just giving you that example that contradictory texts can be within one text. So Henry V as, right? Henry V as a patriotic play celebrating England and English king, but Henry V as an anti-war play, Henry V as a play that exposes power structures and explains to us how power operates in everyday transaction. So same is true of Tempest, Prospero as a providential figure to Prospero as a colonial bully today. So in all that, let's say you look for this idea that you have contradictory meanings, and what is very significant is, right? See, deconstruction is not something that you take from outside to inside. It all happens inside itself, right? You are not taking high-sounding interpretations from outside and you put them on the text. No, the text must betray itself. I think that's a very important statement that he makes. Now, the next point that I would like to make is about what is called a Sylvan historian, an expression that John Keats uses, and a new historicist, right? What is the difference, let's say, between these two? Now, who is the Sylvan historian, right? I'm adapting Keats. I'm not explaining Ode on a Grecian urn. I'm adapting that expression from Keats. Now, Sylvan historian's job is to weld the world of reality and the world of his own or her own vision through the power called imagination, right? So the urn is called a Sylvan historian, which is, say, pleasantly rural or pastoral. It tells a tale and it can transport you to an imaginative world, right? You escape reality, or you are in that state of bliss, right? Like Darkling, as he says in Ode to Nightingale, you are away from this world in an imaginative world to have a great sense of joy, a great sense of, say, happiness, where you are not able to experience this in the real world. In other words, imagination posits a brilliant reality for you, and that reality is real as long as you are in that particular world. Right? So that is, say, the job of a Sylvan historian. So you can say that the earlier paradigm of art is the job of a Sylvan historian to create an amazing work of art which escapes history. Right? It's not rooted in history. We should not have irritable reaching after facts, Keats says in one of his letters. Now, Stephen Greenblatt very significantly says, in this passage is very important from his Renaissance self-fashioning. In one stroke, he has responded to two things. One, liberal humanism, which considers literature to be a timeless phenomenon. Liberal humanism considers literature to deal with essences, believing that those essences are transcendental and timeless. And number two, he obviously has debunked what the formalists have done. Right? We just go through that passage. Right? Detached reflection upon behavioral codes. Right? A view from safe distance. Right? This doesn't help, he says. He says it diminishes our grasp of art. And what is the art's concrete functions according to, say, Stephen Greenblatt? It has a huge social function. And what is that social function? The social function is obviously to understand that literature obviously is a projection of power structures. It's a creation of power structures. And those power structures are very much in, say, operation in all the literary texts. That's why I told you, in one stroke, he denounces liberal humanism by saying that you don't agree with the timeless, cultureless, universal human essence. New Historicism is against, say, this belief that any literary text is timeless. Now, it is timeless in one sense. For a new historicist, also it's timeless because you read Shakespeare today so that it is relevant to our own context. Right? You read Henry V, you understand the processes of war and all that happens during the war, and that is obviously relatable to our own situations. You know that, say, politically it came after the post-Vietnam and the globalized, say, kind of world. That's why these academicians thought about this, and that's why I called it an ethical failure. They consider it to be an ethical failure. And then, let's say, from Scott Wilson, he makes a very important statement. New historicism dissolves history and its grand narratives. Right? We have a term in new historicism, which I will take up later, called grand narratives to counter histories. Grand receipts or grand narratives are, in one sense, falsification of history. And grand receipts are monolithic. They can never be plural at any point in time. Right? So we do not agree with the historical background and the literary foreground. And number two, we don't believe that literature can be timeless, cultureless, and universal human essence. By cultureless, we mean every single text is rooted in the culture that has produced this work of art. And the second point he makes, it is self-regarding, autonomous, closed system is attacking formalism. Formalists very clearly said that a literary text is autonomous, and you know the technical word that they used was autotelic. Right? A text is autotelic in the sense that it's an isolated thing. You never ever connect it with either the author or, let's say, the circumstances that produced a work of art. No biographical material and no socio-political cultural material in a work of art. You look at that particular work of art not for any other purpose, but you look for organic unity within a particular text. So this is formalism's, say, notion. So in one stroke, in Renaissance self-fashioning, this man has rejected both liberal humanism and, say, literary formalism, Anglo-American formalism, you can say. Now, when you come to, say, Scott Wilson, he says, you have new historicism dissolving history and its grand narratives into a series of idiosyncratic accounts. I like that expression, idiosyncratic accounts, meaning you don't, say, give authenticity to it. You don't think that that history is, say, infallible. Right? That history is infallible. You can never, ever say. Right? Because history is written by a human. And it is impossible for you to bracket out your subjectivity when you create, say, history. But don't forget, history also is an interpretation of the past. It is an interpretation of the past. So it is impossible for you to eliminate your historical prejudices. So what does new historicism do? It considers history also to be a grand receipt And we look for petit récits, mini narratives, that you have multiple histories coming out. Whereas old historicism considered history to be as just what is, right? With capital I, capital E. I mean, what history is just what is. But when you come to say new historicism, they say it need not be what is. It is what you have done to the past by way of interpretation. Now we go to a few conceptual frameworks. Let's say when you take tradition, since I mentioned liberal humanism, we believe that literature was a representation of a vision that only poets are capable of having. In other words, it is a projection of an ideal dream of an author mediated through his or her imagination. But now we have given up that idea. We believe in representation of life, which means life has already been presented and you represent it in order to counter or radically examine what has already happened in the past. Right? In other words, you see, let's say, a kind of an intertextuality in a different sense, where every text takes on the previous one. So this is not in the way in which Eliot talked about tradition and individual talent. Their tradition is very positive. Tradition is a backdrop. Tradition is a wall on which you lean. But here it's representation, where a creative writer, again consciously or unconsciously, indulges in a critical imaginative exercise and again consciously or unconsciously embeds subversive texts. Now don't forget that Shakespeare could not have written Henry V as a subversive text when monarchy was supreme. Right? That's why I told you Shakespeare wasn't free. Every playwright was given a clear historical brief to write from. So he could not have subverted, let's say, the authority at that time, but his genius allows for subversion. Right? His genius allows for subversion. So what we understand is these subversive texts are now getting foregrounded through new historical reading, employing or appropriating deconstructive modes of reading language. And what is the mode of understanding? We call it epistemology, right? And going back to the first one, reality with capital L will obviously be the ideal dream. Reality with small r will be the realism of the 19th century. Now we talk about realities, where, as I told you, historical mini narratives are more important, and these mini narratives are recorded in literary texts. Then reason, imagination. We began with non-verbal flashes of understanding which get verbalized. Literature, we know, is articulating the inarticulatable, the earlier conception. But today, they are consciously articulated structures or meaning, or unconsciously articulated structures of meaning. Right? So today we believe, if, let's say, it has been pro-establishment, and if it had been consciously pro-establishment, then we accuse the author for having articulated a false consciousness. Right? We have articulated, he has articulated or she has articulated a false consciousness. So again, going back to Foucault's idea, history and discourse are caught in a happy or unhappy relationship, right? Where one energizes the other, right? One contributes to the other. And we use the word utterance, which I again mentioned later when Bhakti uses the word utterance. So in other words, new historicists considered literature to be a very powerful agency to circulate power. Now the next slide, I'm not going to deal with it completely. These are the articles of faith that Cleon Brooks, let's say one of the important formalist critics in the US, provides us with in order to understand what literature is. I just focus on 2 or 3 here. It's a description and an evaluation of its object. Right? As I told you, neither the critic nor the poet is expected to be subjective. The critic knows what to look for. You know what makes a structure, what can create an organic unity. So it's a description and an evaluation of its object. And the second one is important, what you call organic unity. Obviously, they go back to Aristotle, and then later on, say in English literature, they go to Coleridge for this notion of organic unity. Everything is connected to everything else in a literary text, and the job of the critic is to perceive that unity and articulate that unity. So the formal relations become very important. Form and content cannot be separated. And the purpose of literature is not to deal with the particular, but to deal with the general. Right? Which is a point that new historicism, new criticism has obviously responded to in the context of, say, liberal humanism. That the general and the universal can be captured through the particulars. Right now, this is his notion. And in response to that, you have the abjurations of Stephen Greenblatt. So you can say they are articles of faith and they are rejected here. Right? Those articles of faith are rejected here. You call them the abjurations of new historicism. First point he makes is there can be no appeals to genius. Now, what does that mean? See, in one of the YouTube speeches, Stephen Greenblatt says, I am not discounting the power of, say, Chaucer's imagination or Shakespeare's imagination, but I am only saying that there need not be only imaginative flights of fancy or imaginative flights to intuit reality. The author cannot escape his time. The author cannot escape her time. That's what he means by no appeals to genius. And there is always a hidden motive. You may call it a hidden agenda, a message up the sleeve. There can be no motiveless creation. And then again, rejecting liberal humanism, there can be no transcendent or timeless or unchanging representation. Right? Because liberal humanism said humanity doesn't change. Human beings don't change. Like Samuel Johnson says that Shakespeare deals with general passions, and those general passions will never change. And there can be no autonomous artifacts, straight attack on autotelic, or when the formalists considered a work of art to be autonomous. There cannot be any autonomous or autotelic works of art. There can be no expression without an origin and an object, let's say at this particular point. Right? You have to obviously see that somebody is writing for somebody, and that relationship is extremely important. That's where Stephen Greenblatt went to Bakhtin. Because for Bakhtin, an utterance is a word that reflects a human-centered and socially bound aspect of language. Language is used by individuals, but it should be seen in social dimension. It must always be shown in social dimension, and what is more important is the language constantly is in a process of reflection and transformation. So we obviously say that you need to focus on this idea of utterance. Then we created this important word called social energy. Again, we talk about the mutual reciprocity of history and discourse and history, right? And you don't generate, say, spontaneously what is called social energy. It is consciously created. For example, let's say history plays were written during Shakespeare's time or Elizabethan time in order to uphold monarchy. Queen Elizabeth was obviously in a spot of bother. Right? She did not have a very happy realm as we go by the history books of the past. The Virgin Queen of England, they seem to have an amazing time. No, she had a lot of problems. Essex Rebellion shows that. So she needed theatre. She understood the power of theatre to uphold certain values that the establishment believed in. So there can be no spontaneous generation of social energy. The overflow happens only when there is mutuality. That's why I told you it's very clear that one has to write what the establishment asks to write. In a sense, it's a kind of a censorship that you talk about. Now going back, let's say quickly to look at the new historicism and say the historicists, right? Foucault we have mentioned, and then interpretation of literature to the social, political, and historical milieu, right? And then we speak about the particular cultural moment, which is called the age embedded within a particular text. And what is most important is new historicists introduced an excellent mode of reading that they did not privilege the literary text alone. They privilege non-literary texts which can be studied alongside a literary text. that will provide them with an opportunity to look at both literature and the non-literary texts. Those idea of historical background, literary foreground, because when you say historical background and literary foreground, you are privileging a literary text. Now that privileging was not given to a literary text. It was considered to be one of the discourses. So many discourses, it's one of the discourses. But they are contributing, as I told you, to what is called that cultural moment, that one particular cultural moment. So everything matters. Every single scrap of information about the age can contribute to your understanding of that particular period or that particular work of art, which we will take up later as anecdote. And then we understand that ideology is embedded in a work of art. And you say that you situate artistic texts both as products of historical context, that's one, but it is a clear means by which you understand the age, understand the people, understand the author also. Right? You can problematize an author through a new historical reading. In other words, as I used the term earlier, through a new historical reading, you can decanonize a writer. Now we are all familiar with Taine, who created the race milieu movement. So Taine's influence also must be taken into consideration. He said that literature is a product of, say, race, milieu, and time, or race, milieu, and moment. And we use the German word today, Zeitgeist, spirit of the time. Now, for Taine, right, you understand that the environment by which we mean the socio-political, say, historical, cultural forces that are behind the literary text. So that's the environment which creates a work of art. And when he used the word race, he did not mention race in the common sense, but he considered race to be the collective cultural disposition that govern everyone without their knowledge. In other words, we should not forget the fact what is called socio-political conditioning happens to us unconsciously. Acceptable thinking is distributed through larger forms available for us. We don't even know that we are being influenced by them. Right? Our thinking is not our own, to put it in simple terms. Our thinking is not our own. So the word race will talk about those collective cultural dispositions, right, that govern everyone, every single one of us. And we unconsciously get sucked into that. And if you claim that your thinking is, say, unique, your thinking is alone, that you don't understand that you are also being a part of socio-political conditioning. And by milieu, he meant the particular circumstances that distorted or developed a particular person. And the moment, as I told you earlier, we use the word zeitgeist. Moment is also connected with the word momentum, movements of things, but it's collectively put together through a term called zeitgeist. Now going to the text, let's say, of Stephen Greenblatt himself. What did he say about capitalism and what capitalism does? One thing is capitalism has provided us with an oscillation, a powerful and effective oscillation between the establishment of distinctive discursive domains and the collapse of those domains, right? And the collapse of domains. In other words, as I told you, every work of art is a set of contraries. Instead of looking for unity, we look for disunity today. If you say Henry V is a patriotic play, then you say Henry V is an anti-war play, then you are giving two contradictory interpretations to the same text. A king who is eulogized, a king who is, say, exonerated for everything that he does, ultimately is blameworthy. He is condemned for what is done, and that is done by commoners in the play. So a literary text is obviously, say, a product of distinct discursive domains and the collapse of those domains into one another. And Stephen Greenblatt says, I'm interested in this restless oscillation. A text must betray itself, and a new historical reading makes a text betray itself. Right? So you see that there is a restless oscillation. And very interestingly, there is what he calls a kind of methodological self-consciousness. Right? Instead of losing ourselves into a work of art, instead of, say, getting into that world and darkling, you listen along with Keats, transported to a new world. No, you are constantly looking for. It's almost like an actor, say, who is conscious of what she or he is performing. At the same time, he is supposed to be involved in the role that he or she plays. So we almost play the role of an actor in new historical reading. It is self-consciousness and an apparent absence of self-consciousness. So we call it a methodological self-consciousness, right? And we don't, like the old historicists, believe in the faith or believe in what is called the transparency of science and interpretative procedures. That's exactly what the old historicists did. They believed in the transparency of science. They never problematized science, right? They had that one-to-one relationship, right? They never questioned the relationship between the word and its meaning, and the word and its semantic possibilities, for example. That's why Bhaktin wanted to comment on that word utterance very significantly. And then, for Stephen Greenblatt, New Historicism, a work of art according to New Historicism, is a set of manipulations. Right? Every text is a set of manipulations, and it is a negotiation between a creator or a class of creators. See how he say ropes in class, right? And equipped with complex, communally shared repertoire of conventions and institutions and practices of society. So there can be no motiveless creation. There is always from to somebody. So you obviously cannot escape, as I told you earlier, your own subjectivity. And he very clearly said that the general movement is from mimetic theory of art, which has obviously been explained in the context of liberal humanism as representation of life, to an interpretative model. Right? Instead of experiencing joy, that aesthetic bliss, aesthetic delectation, whatever term that you use, we have come to understand that this model is more interpretative. And Stephen Greenblatt says in the towards the Poetics of Culture that he is not interested in defining New Historicism, but he would situate it in a practice. Right? He would like to situate it as a practice. Right? So that is the most important point that he makes. Now these are certain terms that we need to associate ourselves in the context of New Historicism. I'll take them, not all, but we'll take almost all, let's say, in our discussion that follows before I go to the praxis part of it. This is all part of theory. I'll take the practice of New Historicism with a few examples from Shakespeare and a few, say, examples from India later. Anecdote, I've already told you earlier that any scrap of information can be relevant in our study of literature. You don't consider anything to be extraneous, right? You don't consider anything to be extraneous, right? Everything has an intrinsic value, particularly if it's produced during that cultural moment. It can have a bearing on the text. That's why I use the word intertextual rather differently, not in Kristeva sense. Intertextual in the sense every text is connected to every other text, meaning literary texts and non-literary texts are in a beautiful process of meaning making. So anecdote, you say. Archive obviously takes us to the past. I told you a huge corpus is developed. Carceral is connected to the idea of prison, and that takes us to Foucault. Right? The panopticon surveillance that he speaks about, that we are constantly being watched. Right? Like Derrida says in Fear of Writing, that even he has problems in articulating, say, all that he feels sometimes, right? Sometimes, but he needs to overcome that fear, right? He has to overcome that particular fear. Circulation of power, again, going back to Foucault, that every single discourse is obviously, say, provided by the power structures that are in operation, right? So power is circulated through literature. Right? We in liberal humanism consider literature's power to be different. But here, power, let's say in literature, is the operation of power. There it was imaginative power of the author and imaginative power of the critic. Right? Here it's a different idea. Containment takes us to, say, carnivalesque. Subversion and containment are very important terms in the context of New Historicism. right? Subversions, when allowed subversions come into play, they are not subversions at all. Like I told you, in a carnival, a king can play the role of a clown. A clown can play the role of a king, but only during that time frame called the carnival. You don't expect the clown to go next day, let's say, to the court and tell the king, I am the king of this country. He will be whipped or even be beheaded. So in that particular context, containment can happen when you allow subversion to happen. So subversion is created in order to contain. For example, say in Henry V, you have a character called Williams, an ordinary soldier, who has a conflict with the king, not knowing that he is the king of the country. He comes as Sir Thomas Erpingham, and in that conversation, he says that when blood is your argument, you have no business to talk about patriotism, and he openly says that you will ransom, the king will ransom himself if England loses the battle to France. And then there's a conversation between the king, not, I mean, as I told you, Williams doesn't know that he's king. Now that is a very important point where you subvert, he throws a gauntlet at the king, right? And then ultimately the subversive voice is heard in Henry V. But in the final analysis, when the war is won, that subversive voice is muted. And muting subversive voices is containment. Context, obviously, what is the context? It's not literary context anymore, multiple contexts. Hegemony, we understand the operation of power. Then we have commented on who history, what is history, who is a historian, who is a historicist. Ideology is constantly there. And counter-history is a reaction against the grand results. I will begin with counter-history. He called counter-history to be a spectrum of assaults on grand results inherited from the last century. I said you go to the past very significant because there's so much on the Renaissance, right? You have so much on the Renaissance that you can always look for contradictory texts now, right? So counter-histories, according to him, opposes not only the dominant narratives, but questions the prevailing modes of historical thoughts and methods of research. That is at the present time. Now, what is the net result of a new historical reading? Is it merely, let's say, an experience of the past or mere response to the past? No. A new historical reading has its own contemporary relevance. Right? You look at your own historical thoughts or modes of historical thought at your own given time, and then you see a kind of a parallel. Right? When you say every playwright was given a clear brief, then we can look at our own censorship today. Are authors free? Are authors allowed to say what they want? Are authors say allowed to what is called create as many mini narratives as possible to challenge the grand recit? So we are interested in the prevailing modes of thought and methods of historical research. And he says grand receipts of 19th century began, say, as counter-histories perhaps. But counter-history and history, he says, they are in a constant conflictual process. Right? They are in constant conflictual or continuous, say, conflictual process. They are always there, right? What is called, say, the presentation and its subversion. Right? The presentation and the subversion are constantly going to happen. In other words, you can say counter-history foregrounds the fact that there is what is called a dynamic interplay of networks of, say, power relationships. Right? You have networks of power and subversion. Now, that dynamic interplay is what counter-history will be able to provide. Now, anecdote is extremely important. Right? Anecdote means, as I told you, an apparently innocuous material ultimately is able to throw a lot of light on the existing text. Right? It responds to refinement. Right? The first point that he makes is that anecdote produces the effect of the real. In his book, Practicing, say, New Historicism, along with Catherine Gallagher that he wrote. Now, what does an anecdote do? It's an oblique way to into literature or enter into literature so that you make literature into a polemical discourse. The dialectics become extremely important at that particular point in time. In other words, it's not a happy experience of being transported to a world of joy. And once you come out of the text, you also say forlorn. No. You are constantly aware. You are constantly aware of what's happening in that particular text. So uses this term. They are ahistorical apparently, but they achieve historical significance when they are plugged up by the teleological narration, he says, and anecdotes open up the text. Right? Anecdotes open up the text. And Stephen Greenblatt gives an amazing example. We all know John Dover Wilson, right? Amazing Shakespearean critic, right? Now, he very clearly articulated the fact that Queen Elizabeth wasn't scared when Richard II became very popular. Right? We know the story. Richard II was performed in many places. It moved out of the theatrical space to impact ordinary people, and that is connected to the Essex Rebellion. Why did Richard II become popular? Right? A rightful king is not only, say, usurped, but also put to death in the final analysis. And Queen Elizabeth did make a statement, right, which you see then. I am Richard II, know you not that. That's what she seemed to have exclaimed. Right? She seemed to have explained this. Don't you know that I am Richard II? I am completely unhappy that Richard II is being performed in street corners, in certain people's houses, where seeds of subversion are sown, let's say, when this play is shown to the audience. And when this play is shown to the audience. And then, what is the anecdote here? John Russell Brown, let's say, Dover Wilson goes to Germany, right, in 1939, to give a lecture on Richard II, right, to give a lecture on Richard II, and he articulates the same idea that Bolingbroke is a dangerous person. Bolingbroke is an usurper. Bolingbroke ought not to have been allowed, though history had allowed him. And the Germans who were there in the audience understood that the Bolingbroke of their country was Hitler at that time. Adolf Hitler at that time. They had a democracy which was very weak. It was a weakened democracy, but Hitler wanted to completely upturn German politics. And Dover Wilson's lecture on Shakespeare's Richard II, because he brought in his Elizabethan background, his Elizabethan worldview, not the Elizabethan worldview. He brought his Elizabethan worldview and clearly said that Hitler has to be stopped. He openly did not say that. He definitely suggested that Hitler has to be stopped, like Bolingbroke ought to have been stopped in the context of things. So Richard II can either be seen as a hymn to Tudor monarchy, or it can be an absolutely subversive text. And it's believed that Shakespeare had to stop the production of Richard II. Now, coming back to this anecdote is very important to suggest that you see the operation of worldviews and your own suggestions completely coming, let's say, into your reading of a particular text. So very innocuous, right? Say John Dover Wilson's, say, explanation of Richard II in Germany leads, say, Stephen Greenblatt to look at Richard II and all the, say, polemics embedded in it and all the conflicts embedded in it at that particular point in time. And the word archival, we call it reading within the archival continuum. Right? Archive, as I told you, what is archival continuum? When you look at that expression, right? So, archival continuum is the materials that are available at the same time. That's why I told you the literary and the non-literary are not binary opposites. Earlier they were. The non-literary did not matter in the production of the literary. But they actually are in a beautiful relationship, beautiful in the sense that they give rise to so many multiple texts. That what is very important is reading literature within the archival, say, continuum is the method, is a vivid encapsulation of the new historical method, where it is this archival continuum that either speak about the Puritan attack on the carnival. I'll just briefly deal with Twelfth Night in my praxis part, or the imposition of slavery, the rise of patriarchy, the hounding of deviants, all those things that matter in the context of creating an establishment. Now, Foucault's most important idea, because the word carceral comes from the word carcer, which means a prison. That's why I use that expression, panoptical surveillance. Right? The idea of panoptical surveillance. So, history is present in a text. Right? Though you do contribute, you obviously deal with the imagination of the writer. The first burst of intuition, nobody is questioning that. But a literary text cannot escape the presence of history. I'll go to the praxis part. Right? Practice. The first text that I'm choosing is As You Like It, because I'm going back to the early modern period that, say, the new historicists have done already. Now we are all familiar with Forest of Arden. Forest of Arden as an ideal landscape in Shakespeare's As You Like It. It's a transformative space. Everybody who enters that space, let's say, gets transformed. Right? Oliver gets transformed. Duke Frederick gets transformed. Right? All the apparently evil people get transformed in that particular context. Now, why is the problem, say, arising now when you look at the Forest of Arden? Now, you know that famous speech of the Duke Senior, right, who has happily accepted his being thrown out of his own country. He is in a forest space now. And Duke Senior was obviously praised for his emotional and spiritual resilience to stay in a place which doesn't augur well for him as a king or a duke. Right? So he says very clearly, I'm not worried really. Right? Is this not a space completely away from the envious court? Right? Is this not a space which does not have all the negatives of the city space that we have left? And that famous lines, he finds tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and he sees good in everything. Right? Then, when, say, the first Lord comes and tells him about killing animals in the forest cape, Jacques, the melancholy philosopher in the play, what did he think? What said Jacques? Did he not moralize this spectacle? Now, I have talked about a subversive voice, right? Jacques is normally, let's say, almost a comic figure, though he articulates that famous all the world is a stage speech in Shakespeare. Right? In other words, he almost has created an impression that he doesn't matter. The Duke matter, Orlando matters, Rosalind matters, Celia matters. Jacques is there, let's say. But he is an amazing commentator. Right? He very clearly says, the body of the country, city, court, yard, out of this our life, he says, we are usurpers. Right? Now, don't forget, the Duke has been thrown out. His brother has occupied the throne now. But now he says, you are the usurper of this space. You are a tyrant, you all, referring all the entire entourage of the Duke. Right? What's worse, you frighten the animals. You kill them up in their assigned and native dwelling place. There's so much, let's say, with regard to ecology today, so much with regard to bioregion today. There is so much with regard to biospheric egalitarianism today when you take eco-critical discourse. And he says, in that kind, you swear, you do more usurp. You are a greater usurper than your brother, Duke Frederick. Duke Senior is not named in the play. Now, this is Jacques' response, a voice that comes from within, let's say, the voice that comes from within in that particular context, right? A voice that comes from within the text itself. So you have a voice that goes against the voice of the Duke. Another voice, let's say, in the play comes from Corinth, let's say, a very naive shepherd in the play. Now, when you look at what he says again, right, I am another man's slave. Right? I am another man's slave. Right? I have no power over my place. I have lost my bioregion. Right? I need to obviously take care of the people who have come to, say, overpower me. So we understand today, through a new historical reading, Corin, who is a conventionalized figure, right? People believe that he's a conventionalized figure, but he's an amazing socio-political commentator who throws light on what is called the urban exploitation of the rural poor, the urban exploitation of the rural landscape. Now, where is new historicism there? If you do not have a material to support this argument, there was the Tillage Act in 1580, let's say 1563. Much before, let's say, that's the time that Shakespeare was writing this play. Right? The Tillage Act of 1563 very clearly talked about this conversion of arable to pasture, and then more importantly, the conflict between the usurpers and the people who are usurped in that particular point. Right? This was a law that was there, right? And obviously there was a lot of problems during that particular place. Right? Agrarian legislation reflected an attempt to resist the rise of new types of convertible husbandry. Right? So this is the most important point. This is a law that the Tillage Act of 1563, for a new historian, this becomes an amazing material to look at Corin, to look at Jacques, to look at Duke, let's say, quite different. Now we understand through these things that As You Like It is apparently a celebration of the pastoral, but it is a critique of the pastoral. Right? It's a critique of the pastoral. And then today we have, let's say, two groups of people, the foresters and the hunters. Right? So you have what you call in As You Like It. So you have the Duke Senior, you have Amiens, you have Shaw, you have Duxton and Shepherd, all experiencing and understanding the reality of the forests of Arden in diverse ways, in different ways. Right? Corin and Jacques on one side, you should say, and all the others on the other side. So we understand this dialectical thing that's happening, that constant conflict between voices, constant conflict between viewpoints, and the Tillage Act very clearly talks about rural exploitation. Right? And all this happened when Shakespeare was obviously creating his forest of art. It had a real space also somewhere near Stratford. But what is most important is our reading of the forest of Arden as a transformative space, as it gives everything to everybody who comes in. Right? As he says, let's say you can listen to sermons in stones and you can have a perception of, say, see good in everything that you have in your midst. No, the forest of Arden is a hugely problematized space. Right? So we understand that foresters are people who are non-exploitative, who align themselves with the, say, forest region like Corin and others. The hunters, on the contrary, indulge in optimal exploitation of that particular place. So in one sense, you can say that in As You Like It, when you take Corin, or Jacques, though he comes from the court, he comes, let's say, from the family of Orlando, let's say, an Oliver, he is entirely different when he's there in the forest of Arden. So Corin and the forest say Jacques will represent the foresters, and Duke Senior and his group will represent what is called, let's say, the hunters. Right? So the foresters who have a spiritual link with the forest, and these people who will only exploit what is called the forest game. Right? And goes on, let's say, that Shakespeare has beautifully attempted to provide us with these sensitive issues which are political, social, and ecclesiastical. Right? Hathaway makes its statement. Pastoral is always used as a mask. Right? When you understand pastoral critically, when you unmask the pastoral, you understand. Right? You understand that forest of Arden, as Hill says, is a violent place in 1590s, full of poverty, fighting between people, outlaws, assaults, and an impact on the economic change, or the impact on the, say, people, particularly using this idea of economic change that happens. So in that context, we understand we have a Tillage Act, then you have the prevailing circumstances during that time. You look at As You Like It today, it becomes a hugely problematic text. So in one sense, let's say you see a lot of tragic potential in As You Like It, though we deem it a comedy when you take that play into consideration. So pastoral becomes a social critique, as I said earlier, and you have a lot of tradition. Shakespeare, after all, Marjorie Gerber says that this has happened, let's say, in the past also, using the pastoral as a means. Now we take that famous line from Twelfth Night, the Toby Belch, right, when he is very angry with, say, the man who is in control of that house, Malvolio. Out of tune, sir, you lie. Art any more than a steward dost thou think? Because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale. Right? There can be no more cakes and ale. Right? When you take that statement, very casual statement, innocuous statement, they drink and make themselves merry, and this man doesn't want that to happen in his household. Though he's not the boss, right? He's just a steward of the house. He's not the boss. But this passage is connected to the conflict between the Puritans and theatres, Globe in particular, but Puritans versus all the theatres of that particular period. Right? A lot of objections have come. Theatre space was considered to be a terrible space, an evil space. Right? Puritans wanted the closure of theatres, and this idea, this response in Shakespeare to the Puritans is a political statement that he makes through Sir Toby Belch, again in a comedy. Again in a comedy, apparently innocuous, because they gull Malvolio, they cut him to size, they make him, let's say, a kind of a ridiculous figure, even a ludicrous figure towards the end, and that is Shakespeare's response to Puritan attack on theatre. But don't forget, in 1642, theatres were closed, right? That act of September 1642 and Act of 7th February 1648 completely closed down theatres, and until 1660 there were no theatres at all. So Sir Toby Belch's comment, almost asking for allowing to be drinking and making merry, is not just that. It is a response to Puritan attack on theatre. Right? So then we say that there is this film called Shakespeare Wala, with which I will stop. Shakespeare Wala is an amazing film made in 1965. It's about a touring Shakespearean troupe who find that they are no longer popular in India. Right? You can look at it post-colonially. Right? Post-independence and the birth and growth of Bollywood puts an end to Shakespearean productions. Right? Puts an end to Shakespearean productions. Now, Shakespeare Wala is important to us because we never understand, like Harish Trivedi makes a very important statement in Shakespeare in colonial India. Shakespeare is a political site, he says. And Shakespeare is a political site, S-I-T-E. That you don't accept him merely as a great writer of the West, nobody's denying that fact. But he obviously was used for a colonial agenda. Right? He was used for a colonial agenda. So you understand that the waning of interest in Shakespeare is a significant post-colonial response. But what is more important is you have the presence of white men in the play and a few Indian actors within the troupe and a rejection of Shakespeare. There is an amazing scene in the film. There is a person who performs tricks with monkeys. He has also lost his job. Right? He is out of job now. Nobody is interested in watching the person perform tricks with this monkey. And that man actually encounters these people. And the movie almost suggests that performing Shakespeare and performing monkey tricks, say, are almost the same. Meaning that both are, say, antiquated. They have become anachronistic. Right? They have become anachronistic. So Shakespeare, like the Grand British Hotel, has no place in New India, though the white man says, you are up to all cheap and flashy stuff when you take the Bollywood idea into consideration. So what is more important? How do you make a new historical reading? We need to look at the movie doesn't record. When you criticize that movie, it doesn't record the cultural scenario of that particular time, in that particular moment. Right? It's a movie, fine. It's an excellent movie, fine. All that is good. But say the movie could have problematized The movie could have obviously embedded more cultural texts. That's a critique that you level against these people, right? So the unique historical moment that has to be recorded, going back to time, race, milieu moment, that zeitgeist of post-colonial India is absent in Shakespeare. We are more interested in the loss of interest in Shakespeare than the positives that you can think in the context of post-colonial context. So that's why we say in the last part, say this has to be mediated, right? This critic says this has to be mediated through, right? Amazing comment that Parmit Datta makes. Say it is neither mediated nor sifted through various cultural, social, historical, political, ideological filters of the target culture. Right? It ought to have been done. A new historical reading tells us that there is a conscious absence or an unconscious one, but a conscious absence of the fact that the various social, cultural, historical, political, ideological issues in post-colonial India, it's not just the rise of Bollywood that rejects Shakespeare. Right? That's one of the reasons. It's not just that alone. So we need to understand that. That's why she says, let's say, you go through all spaces, various territorial spaces, but we do not get a vivid and vibrant portrayal of the pluralities. Right? It's just one point of view. Shakespeare not being popular in post-colonial India, and a British troop, let's say, not being wanted in various spaces. Right? It's like the death of monarchy in India is the death of Shakespeare also in India, in the movie itself. So what we need is the portrayal of plurality. So you condemn that. When you look at the time that Shakespeare in this movie, Shakespeare Wala, is made, and then look at the flow of the historical trajectories at that particular time, I think the movie could have embedded more realities, which could have problematized, let's say, the issues. In other words, new historical reading very clearly says that what is absent. So far, new historical reading, I have said, is what looks for what is present, the contrary text. Right? The contrary text within a particular text is what we have been seeing. But here we also speak about the absence, right? That these things are absent. So this movie, in that sense, has miserably failed. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that new historical readings are not an opening of the Pandora's box, something terrible coming out. We normally get scared. Let's say when you do a new historical reading, you are destroying a text. No, it's not a Pandora's box, but I adapt a line from Keats's Ode to Nightingale. Charmed magic casements can come out of every new historical reading because it gives rise to a complex and a multivalent work, as I told you. You have almost, as I told you, a palimpsest of texts. Right? One text contains so many texts, and you explore each one, then you understand the dynamic relationship between these texts, among these texts, right? But among these texts, like I told you, Henry V, a great, say, national play, but Henry V, the worst, say, national play in the sense of, say, the commoners questioning, the common soldiers questioning. So new historical reading, as I told you, now makes the text in a very different sense. Again, I will adapt Keats. It's a thing of beauty. It's a joy forever. Its loveliness increases and it never passes into nothingness. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for your wonderful session. And we have lots and lots of questions popped up in the chat window. Shall we start with the questions?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm ready.
Yes. So there's a question from Aparna Sri Preeti, and it is literary academia's predominant criticism against new historicist reading is that it contains less literature and more non-literary texts. What is your opinion on this, sir?
Yeah, that's what the main idea is. This, see, a literary text is not merely for its literariness. Right? Formalism looks for its literariness alone. But today, we live in a time that a literary text, apart from its literariness, nobody is discounting the fact that amazing symbols are used, amazing metaphors are used. But a literary text is obviously has multiple co-texts, co-hyphen texts, right? Con-hyphen texts. right? So it obviously, it doesn't discount literature, but it makes literature more valent, right? You look for more multivalency within a literary text because it ropes in multiple disciplines and multiple discourses.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Ms. Anita. Sir, would you please define the term grand narrative and how this term is related to historicism?
Yeah. See, when you use the word grand narrative, we obviously mean a monolithic account of anything. It's a discourse, it's part of a discourse, right? Grand recit or grand narrative. Now, this claims, every grand narrative claims not only authenticity, but also a sacredness about it, right? That which cannot be questioned, that which cannot be dethroned. Now, such grand narratives have been operations of power, right? Power structures have created these grand narratives, and these grand narratives have sustained those power structures, and those power structures have obviously continued the status quo, which has to change in all contexts. In every single subjugated context, let's say, you see the grand narratives have been responsible. In any context you can see, where power structures have been in operation. Any discourse, race discourse, caste discourse, class discourse, right? Ethnic discourse. So you see the grand narrative ultimately is that which we almost call it a stumbling block, as it were. And it canonizes a particular point. It canonizes a particular point of view. So for new historicism, grand narratives have to be questioned because it is a radical departure from the grand narratives. And your job is to look for petite narratives or petite recits or multiple mini narratives. So it's very important for new historicism.
Thank you, sir. And the next question is from Ms. Kaushalya. Will the present day social and political factors create an impact in the rereading and writing of mythologies?
Yes, definitely, yes. See, we need to, see, that's why I said the reading of the past by new historicists is to have a meaningful, say, context in the present. Right? See, we have so many readings of mythologies now. Right? Even people like Kavita K looking at, say, myths, women looking at myths, for example. Or Carol Ann Duffy looking at very important Mrs. Shakespeare, Mrs. Icarus, Mrs. Midas, for example. You go back, let's say, to these mythological characters. Yes, new historical reading is not just the reading of the past, but they must definitely have a bearing on the present. Otherwise, it's pointless. Otherwise, it's pointless. You need to see that they have a bearing on the present. Now, like power structures operated and created those discourses in the past, we need to be alive of those power structures and those discourses that are in operation today. So in that sense, you look at myths very differently. You have to look at myths very differently. Right? In one sense, let's say, even myths can become grand narratives. You need to question them. You need to question them.
And there's a question from Professor Ilango. What is the difference between the collective unconscious and the collective cultural dispositions?
Yeah. See, the collective unconscious, that the term that is used, let's say, in the context of psychology, right? Carl Jung's idea, right? What he calls the spiritus mundi, is that which is embedded in single person's individual consciousness, right? Like myths and legends and history, your dispositions and so on. But for him, let's say for him, they are almost static, in the sense they are there, embedded in you. Out of that collective unconsciousness, things come. But when you talk about, say, disposition now, cultural dispositions now, we need to make that which is static more dynamic. Right? So the cultural dispositions in the present day context, in the new historical context, will obviously mean, can you at that time look for opposite voices? Now, how many of us know, say, like I always tell my students in class, we say golden age of the Guptas. How sure are we that the golden age of Guptas was golden? Now, who said that it was the golden age of Guptas? What were the opposite voices, radical voices? But these cultural dispositions can create conditioning. So we need to be wary. We need to be really aware to be escaping from what is called socio-political conditions. But collective unconscious is every culture can create it, because like myths, like legends, like history, right? From our own collective unconsciousness, these things keep springing up. But our job is to radically examine each one of these memories that we have within the context of culture.
Nice, sir. Great explanation. Thank you, sir. And another question is from Dr. Giri Prasad from Kakatiya University. And he has asked, what is unmasked in traditional text? How is it locked in present modern text?
Yeah. See, I use the word unmasking to go back to what Derrida and others have said. See, unmasking is the means by which you give visibility to texts that have been hidden either deliberately or texts that you have not seen at all. That's why I adapted Keats again. Right? Its loveliness increases because you are looking for more political texts. Now, a new historical text, new historical reading is an act of unmasking, right? Because something is masked, something is hidden. So every new historical reading is a significant act of unmasking. Now, this act of unmasking need not pertain only to Elizabethan literature, early modern literature. It can obviously apply to any text, right? Now, any political, socio-political, constant, say, awareness of the socio-political realities that produce texts. And with that awareness, you interpret a particular text, right? You will understand that you are going to indulge in a process of unmasking. So it can happen to a modern text, it can happen to a postmodern text, it can happen to an ancient text, like say even Chaucer's text, for example, or what these people have done with regard to the Renaissance. Now, act of unmasking is unpeeling, let's say. In other words, constantly look for the contraries within the text, right? Unmasking is to make the text betray itself, going back to the comment I made.
Thank you, sir. And there is a lengthy question from Ms. Murugeshwari. Let me read that, sir. While history is biased in many ways, could literature amalgamated with history be unbiased? If history and literature are culture constrained, what's the need to interpret it to other cultures or society? If they can be applied or related to other cultures, how could they be culture constrained?
Good. Now, the first point that I will take, let's say, now when you take, what is the first point you made?
So history is biased. Why history is biased in many ways?
Now, the question is, can literature be unbiased? Yes. Now, if you have a conscientious writer, and when you interact with history most meaningfully, you can definitely rectify history. That's what people have done. Great thinkers, great writers have obviously, say in one sense, put an end to a lot of historical misconceptions. Now, I am not saying that history, literature always, let's say, is hand in glove with history to create falsifications. No. Literature can definitely. Now, what is important is today literary texts are used to give up those misconceptions or question those conceptions and show that they are gross misconceptions. So that's the first point. That yes, literature can definitely contribute to the rectification of history. It can and it should. That's why you read it, not for being transported to a new world. What is happening in the present is more important.
So if they can be applied or yes, if they can be applied or related to other cultures, how could they be culture constrained?
See, by culture constraint we mean, say for example, English culture. Since you used the question spiritus mundi, now every culture has its own specificities. You can't deny that, right? Now, culture constraint means, let's say, but the term cultural constraint was used in the context of questioning what is timeless, what is universal. That each culture is constrained within its own, in the sense that you have your own subjectivity. Now, can you compare one culture with another culture? Definitely yes, because we are all human beings and power structures have always operated. Right? A Greek play can throw a lot of light out in our own context. Right? So Antigone can tell us more about women in this context. Now, we are not saying that you can't compare cultures. Now, by cultural constraint, what is meant is, right? Don't go into that paradigm of the text being completely culture-free, universal, timeless. No, it is bound to time. It is bound by the cultural constraints because it's the cultural constraints that produce that particular work. But cultures can be compared, right? Like literatures can be. Why do we read world literature? World literature is reading multiple cultures at the same time. Yeah.
So can lampoons and memes be called as mini narratives?
Yes, yes. Actually, they are coming up, really. Right? Memes particularly are coming up. Lampoons have always been, right? Parodying, lampoons. Now, memes, if they are done with enormous conscious political intention, right? Memes are very powerful, right? It's not merely humorous, right? Memes are not humorous at all. Like I always say, now when you take the cartoons of R.K. Lakshman, right? R.K. Lakshman, in his own way, has been able to provide us with the history of India as it happened during that particular time through his own mode of the common man commenting on it. You agree with him, disagree with him, that's a different thing. But you have been through cartoons commenting on what has been happening in India. Right? Is he a conventional man? Is an established man? That's a different discourse altogether. But this person has been able to comment on India through his cartoons. Now, same is true with lampoons. Memes are important, and memes must be collected actually. Memes must be collected because they are so time specific, because it relates to something that's happening at that particular time. History gets definitely embedded in memes. History definitely gets embedded in memes.
So there is a question from one Ms. Neeraja Gopalakrishnan, a research scholar, and she says the Indian tribal writers, maybe the life and culture of all these Indian tribal writers been misrepresented for ages. Now, can these counter narratives be analyzed in new historical point of view?
Yes. Now, for example, let's say if you take accounts of the tribals, right, as presented by the non-tribals, more importantly, and then they say that this is what this tribe is, and these are the traditions, right? This is what their culture is. This is what they are. They are primitive, right? They don't know. They have no knowledge system. They have no literature. Right? They have no literature. They have no mythology. This has been the criticism. But when you listen to the tribes themselves, right, significant contributions have been made by, say, Professor G. N. Devi, for example. Mahasetu Devi has done enormous contribution to tribal studies. Now, what is most important is, now that the tribals themselves are made to articulate themselves, that the subalterns can speak and will speak. Now, when they narrate themselves, you understand that they go against the grand narratives of the non-tribals about the tribals. So this is a great, yes, new historicism as a reading methodology, right? As a reading methodology, does provide you with an opportunity to question certain assumptions, right? Or rather, baseless presumptions of non-tribals with regard to tribals when these people speak. Or this can also happen when committed non-tribals deal with these people and tell us exactly what they are. As I told you, they have amazing myths, they have amazing literature, right? They have amazing cultures. And we are not romanticizing them. Right? We are not. That also is an extreme point. It's not romanticizing, but to deny them a knowledge system, to deny them that they are primitive, to deny them that they don't have so many things. Now that has to be countered. That grand narrative has to be countered. New historicism will definitely contribute to that.
And there is a question from Professor Sumati Shripati. It is, can we interpret Conrad's Heart of Darkness in perspectives of new historicism?
Yeah, definitely. Heart of Darkness has been interpreted from the kind of post-colonial point of view, right? No longer is Marlowe or Kurtz an unproblematic figures. Heart of Darkness is a hugely, say, politically laden text that even Conrad has been questioned. Leave alone these characters in the novel, even Conrad has been questioned about his own intentions and so on. Definitely, see, even a novel like Heart of Darkness, because you know that this has been done, right? Chinua Achebe and others have commented on Conrad to this particular effect. Yes, you can definitely go to any literary text, very canonical text. Even Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen has been read politically to look for texts that you never would have thought would have been embedded in a novel like Northanger Abbey.
So there is an important question from one Ms. Susan. You spoke about a text being a product of a cultural moment. Can this moment be bracketed, given that time is out of joint and any text in Derridian idiom is invoking ghosts from the past and hence embeds itself in a complex interaction with moments from both the past and the present? So she just wants to know about this cultural moment, sir.
Yeah, see, the idea, see, when I say, see, each cultural moment has its own insulation, and each cultural moment is also broad-based, right? Now, we use the word cultural moment. Now, each cultural moment gets embedded in a literary text, or it gives the necessary impetus for a literary text. So when I use the term, say when I say cultural movement, you take the whole of 16th century, which is so broad based, right? So broad. See, cultural. When I use the word, that's why I use the word zeitgeist. It is more the spirit of the time, right? Each moment is a spirit of the time. Now that obviously will say partake of every literary production or non-literary productions at that time. Now what the historians have done is, why not take non-literary also, right? Why not take the literary and non-literary together? And what is the second part of the question that she made?
And any text in Derridian idiom is invoking ghosts from the past and hence embeds itself in a complex interaction with moments from both the past and the present.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the idea. See, when a text betrays itself, when as I told you, when warring, say, forces of significations can get manifest through a particular text, the past is reviewed, right? It has its impact on the present. So you almost have a kind of, that's why the new historians use the beautiful term archival continuum, right? Archival continuum is an answer to her question.
Okay.
Is an answer to her question.
So the final question is from Professor Chakravarti. History has always been the privilege of the hegemonical forces. It changes with the power centers and structures. Will you please elaborate on it, sir?
Yes, it has always been. Now, history, when you make history making, so today historiography is problematized because, like I told you, right, who writes history, you cannot bracket your own subjectivity. See, a historian in the past was almost given a poet status. A poet can escape his personality and produce a work of art which is transcendental and timeless. Now, that is a belief we had. Now, when you deny that to the poet himself or herself today, you can definitely deny that to the historian also. Right? You have to deny that to the historian also. Any history, right? And particularly that history claims to be the history, right? This is the history you want to claim, and you want to claim a monolithic status, then that historian obviously has to have a problem, right? There is no motiveless creation, not only with regard to literature, but also there can be no motiveless creation in the context of history also. History making has always been associated with power structures, particularly history making that gets canonized, history making that becomes apparently authentic. I bracket that also. Apparently, say authentic. The apparently authentic accounts of history very clearly show, let's say, that the historians are to blame, or historians have to be questioned. Historians definitely have to be questioned. And they do obviously partake of the hegemonic power structures. That's why I told you, even Shakespeare. Right? Now, why did he stop performing Richard II? Right? Why was Richard II given up immediately when this protest came from the Queen? Now, she controlled both the Puritan Corporation and the theatre at the same time. She understood the power of theatrical space. So she controlled. So are the historians controlled. So are, let's say, the artists controlled. Let's say this will happen. The operation of power structures in history making will happen, but radical departures will have to be made by sensible people.
Thank you, sir. Sir, it's truly an excellent presentation on new historicism, and we take a bow for that, sir. On behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank you for that. And the session started with the reason of timeline. You know, raison, that's how you started the slide. And you explained the amalgamation of literature, and you explored on deconstruction and the new historical mode of reading, and especially the examples on Henry IV and Tempest added much more to deconstruction. And the Shakespearean negotiation of Greenblatt has been well analyzed with the abjurations of new historicism. So we have learned a lot from this, and counterhistory, anecdote, whatnot, and so many in your presentation. You've interpreted each and everything very clearly to us, sir. And Parks' part is the best part, I would say, with As You Like It. And I would like to say that it's a diamond among the gems, beautifully explained. And your slides, I have to say that, sir, those are great examples for the budding scholars who are here in this session today in preparing their slides and acknowledging it properly, which is very important. And that was one part which I enjoyed the most. And you introduced the scholars with new terms, and you have instilled and as well as instigated the researchers' thirst within themselves in the new arenas of research. And a big thanks for spending your valuable time on this special day to enlighten us on new historicism and praxis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for moderating the session. And I thank
pleasure,
Dr. Marx, let's say, for being a part of this program. And obviously, huge thanks, let's say, to Dr. Ramsmeier for being a part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Marx.
Thank you, Professor Ganesh.
And it was a great pleasure to be a part of
Thank you,
it.
sir.
Right? And great pleasure to be
Thank you so much.
and a great opportunity to meet friends after a very, very long time. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Marks, any announcement?
No.
Anything else? Yeah.
So friends, let us adjourn here for lunch, and this is a request from the host side. Please join us at 2:45. We'll start the program next session exactly at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.